What would you do if the only thing you had left of a father's legacy was a worthless piece of paper? For Laura Whitcomb, a schoolteacher stranded in the Wyoming Territory in 1876, that paper was a torn survey map, a final insult from the men who had stolen her inheritance. They had left her with nothing but dust, grief, and a map that led nowhere. But the truth waiting in the fibers of that brittle paper, a truth only visible by the light of a desperate flame, would lead her not to gold, but to a secret the mountains themselves had kept. Settle in, and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell a story of quiet courage and a treasure worth more than any claim. The stage was set for a journey that would redefine the meaning of wealth and home, beginning with a single step into the vast, indifferent heart of the West. Laura Whitcomb arrived in South Pass City on the afternoon stage, a woman rendered small by the landscape. The wind, a constant and personal adversary, whipped dust into the folds of her gray traveling dress and pulled strands of brown hair from her tightly pinned bun. She carried a single valise, heavy with books and a few keepsakes, and in her reticule, the folded, torn map that was the sum total of her father's life's work, at least according to his partners. The meeting, a week prior in Cheyenne, had been brief and brutal. Silas Thorne, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, had slid a paltry stack of bills across the polished table. Jedediah Cole, his silent, hulking shadow, had simply watched her, his expression unreadable but deeply unsettling. They spoke of cave-ins, of bad luck, of a vein that had simply vanished. They said her father, an optimist to the last, had died chasing a ghost. The map, Thorne had said with a dismissive wave, was a folly, a drawing of a place that didn't exist. He spent his last months on this, he'd said, a thin veneer of pity in his voice. Take it. A reminder of his imagination. Now, standing in the main street of a town that felt more like a temporary camp than a permanent settlement, Laura felt the weight of that lie. Her father had not been a fool. He had been a scholar of the earth, a man who read stone and soil like she read poetry. His letters to her had been filled not with talk of riches, but of wonder. He'd written of crystalline structures, of formations the likes of which he'd never seen, of a discovery that would change the way men look at these mountains. And then the letters had stopped. The telegram had come, and Thorne and Cole had appeared, vultures in fine suits. They had cheated her. She knew it with a certainty that was cold and hard in her gut, but knowing and proving were two different things in a territory where a signed paper held more power than a daughter's grief. She had just enough money to get to Lander, where she hoped to find work, to start over, to somehow reclaim a life from the ashes of the one they'd burned. The clerk at the stage office, a man with a kind, tired face, had told her the next coach wasn't for 3 days. When she asked about a guide for the journey, he'd pointed her toward the hills. Benjamin Holt has a line cabin a few miles out. He keeps to himself, but he knows the land. Might take you if he's in the mood. Lost his wife to the fever last winter. Hasn't been the same. She found him at dusk. The cabin was exactly as the name suggested. A simple, stark structure on the line between his small ranch and the vast, unowned wilderness. It was weathered to the color of the dry earth, with a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. A man stood by a corral, his back to her, mending a leather strap. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but he moved with a slow, deliberate economy that spoke of weariness. His horse, a sturdy buckskin with a watchful eye, stood patiently nearby. When she called out a greeting, he turned, and Laura saw a face that seemed carved from the same hard country he inhabited. Benjamin Holt was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, but his eyes held the quiet, distant sorrow of a much older man. He listened to her request without expression, his gaze flicking from her face to her dusty, impractical shoes and back again. He said nothing for a long moment, the only sound the wind and the soft snort of his horse. "I'm not a guide," he said finally, his voice low and raspy, as if from disuse. He was a man who had forgotten the habit of speaking to anyone but his animals. But Laura was desperate, and her desperation made her bold. She pressed, explaining her situation, leaving out the details of the theft, but making her need clear. He just shook his head, his refusal a quiet, unbreachable wall. That night, he allowed her to sleep on a pallet by the fire, a gesture of stark hospitality that cost him nothing but offered her everything. The cabin was one room, meticulously clean but spare. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of tins. On the mantel, a single, small tintype of a woman with a gentle smile. His wife. Laura felt like an intruder in his carefully constructed solitude, a witness to a grief that was still raw and breathing in the small space. She couldn't sleep. The day's failure and the vast, silent darkness outside pressed in on her. She took out the map, the symbol of her ruin. In the flickering lantern light, the ink seemed faint, the tears in the paper like wounds. It was useless. Thorne was right. Her father had died for nothing. A wave of despair washed over her, so profound it felt like drowning. What was the point of carrying this reminder of her own powerlessness? She held the corner of the map near the glass of the lantern, the heat warming the paper. For a moment she considered letting it catch, turning the lie to ash. But as the paper grew translucent from the heat and the proximity to the flame, she saw it. A faint, spiderweb-thin line, a different color of ink, emerging from beneath the main survey markings. It wasn't just one line. As she held the map closer, a hidden lattice of trails, symbols, and handwritten notes bloomed into view, like a secret language revealed. What secret had her father encoded in the paper he knew his partners would dismiss as worthless? What truth was he trying to tell her from beyond the grave? What would you have done, holding that impossible hope in your hands? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of the frontier. But for Laura Whitcomb, the discovery was not an end to her troubles. It was the beginning of a far more dangerous journey. The next morning, the air in the cabin was thick with a new kind of tension. Benjamin Holt was already awake, sipping coffee by the cold hearth, his expression as guarded as ever. He had watched her last night, a silent observer from the shadows of his bunk, as she'd held the map to the light. Her gasp of discovery a small, sharp sound in the quiet room. He had said nothing, but his curiosity was a palpable thing. Laura, emboldened by her discovery, laid the map on the rough-hewn table. "I need to follow this," she said, her voice steady. "Not to Lander, somewhere else." He looked at the map, then at her. He saw the same torn paper he had dismissed the day before. "It's a fool's map," he said, his voice flat. "There's nothing in that part of the foothills but rock and wind." She took a deep breath. "Help me," she said, her voice softer now. "Please, I'll pay you what I have. It's not just a claim I'm looking for, it's an answer." She didn't show him the hidden markings, not yet. Some instinct told her to hold that secret close. It was hers and her father's alone. It was the only weapon she had. Perhaps it was the raw sincerity in her voice, or perhaps it was the memory of the intensity on her face in the lamplight. but something in him shifted. He studied her for a long time, his gaze unwavering. "We'll need supplies," he said at last. The words clipped. "We'll ride to South Pass. But if this trail turns into a ghost chase, the deal is off. I take you to Lander from there." It was not an agreement born of kindness, but a transaction. A simple, practical arrangement. Yet for Laura, it felt like a monumental victory. They rode back toward the settlement under a vast, pale sky, Benjamin on his buckskin, Buck, and Laura on a spare mare he kept. A gentle but tired-looking animal. South Pass City looked the same as it had the day before. A raw, wind-scoured collection of buildings clinging to the edge of the wilderness. But as they dismounted in front of the general store, a familiar voice cut through the air, sharp and mocking. "Well, well. Look what the wind blew in. The little school teacher." Silas Thorne stood on the boardwalk, a fat cigar in his mouth, flanked by the ever-silent Jedediah Cole. Thorne's eyes took in the scene. Laura, the sober-faced rancher, the horses packed for a journey. His smile widened. "Still holding on to that scrap of paper, are we? I admire your sentimentality, Miss Whitcomb. Truly. But some treasures are best left buried." His gaze lingered on the leather satchel where she kept the map, a greedy, knowing glint in his eyes. He knew. He knew the map wasn't entirely worthless, but he didn't know its real secret. He thought it was a bluff, or perhaps a clue to a minor, overlooked vein. The condescension in his voice was a physical thing, pressing on her. Benjamin Holt stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Laura and the two men. He didn't say a word, but his presence was a statement. He was a man of the land, weathered and hard, and next to him, Thorne, for all his fine clothes, looked soft and out of place. Thorne's smile tightened. He gave a dismissive flick of his cigar. "Have your adventure, then. The mountains have a way of teaching harsh lessons." He and Cole turned and walked into the saloon, their laughter echoing behind them. The encounter left Laura shaken, but also more determined. Thorne's mockery was the confirmation she needed. There was something out there he wanted, something he thought he'd cleverly hidden by letting her keep the map. As they were tying their supplies onto the pack mule, an old woman approached them from the edge of town. She was Shoshone, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and luminous. She sat on a blanket, a small collection of dried herbs and roots laid out before her. She had watched the exchange with Thorne, her expression unreadable. As Laura passed, the old woman looked up, her gaze piercing. She looked not at Laura's face, but at the satchel containing the map, as if she could see through the leather. "Be careful, little bird," the woman said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You seek the bones of the earth." Laura stopped, confused. I don't understand." The woman's gaze drifted toward the distant, hazy peaks of the Wind River Range. "The stone trees remember what the mountain forgets," she said, the words more a prophecy than a warning. Then she turned her attention back to her herbs, the audience concluded. Laura stood frozen for a moment, the cryptic phrase echoing in her mind. Stone trees. The words meant nothing to her, yet they felt heavy with significance. Benjamin, who had heard the exchange, looked uneasy. He was a practical man, not given to superstitions, but he had lived in this country long enough to respect the things he didn't understand. He nudged his horse forward. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice tight. "The mountains are waiting." They rode out of town, leaving the laughter of the saloon and the old woman's strange words behind them, heading not east toward Lander, but north, into the vast, silent foothills where a dead man's secret lay waiting. The journey began in silence. The trail Benjamin chose was not a trail at all, but a path of his own making, guided by the sun, the lay of the land, and the faint, secret markings on Laura's map. They rode north, with the immense, jagged spine of the Wind River Mountains to their west. A constant, silent witness. The country opened up before them, a rolling sea of sagebrush and dry grass, punctuated by draws and coulees that hid small, determined streams. For the first day, they spoke little. Benjamin seemed to retreat further into his own solitude, his focus entirely on the landscape ahead. He rode with a natural, easy grace, a man perfectly at home in the saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the ground, the sky. Laura, accustomed to the confines of a classroom and the neat, orderly world of books, felt overwhelmed by the sheer scale of her surroundings. The sky was too big, the silence too profound. She felt like a trespasser, a fragile, temporary thing in a land that measured time in geological ages. Her initial hope, born in the flickering lamplight of the cabin, began to feel thin and foolish out here, under the unfiltered glare of the sun. The rancher's skepticism was a quiet, constant presence, a silent counterpoint to her own wavering conviction. He had agreed to this, but he did not believe in it. Their first camp was in a small hollow sheltered by a stand of gnarled, wind-stunted junipers. Benjamin moved with a practiced efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. He had a fire going in minutes, the horses unsaddled and hobbled, and coffee boiling in a tin pot. He worked without a wasted motion, a man who had made 1,000 such camps in his life. He handed her a cup of coffee, black and strong enough to stand a spoon in. The simple gesture felt like a truce. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the flames dancing between them, casting long, flickering shadows. The sun set, painting the western sky in brutal, brilliant strokes of orange and purple. As darkness fell, the world shrank to the small circle of their firelight. "My father loved this," Laura said quietly, breaking the long silence. "He said the land speaks, if you know how to listen." Benjamin looked up from the piece of tack he was mending. He didn't reply, but his gaze was no longer dismissive. It was curious. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not just a stranded schoolteacher, but a woman with a core of unexpected steel, a woman who would chase her father's ghost into the wilderness on the strength of a few hidden lines on a piece of paper. He had lost his wife, his future, his faith in anything beyond the hard realities of survival. He had not expected to be sitting here, under the stars, with this determined, quiet woman who spoke of listening to the land. That night, Laura slept near the fire, wrapped in a bedroll he had provided. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, the cry of a distant coyote, the whisper of the wind through the sage, the soft shuffle and sigh of the horses. Benjamin sat watch, a silhouette against the dying embers, his rifle across his lap. He was not just guarding against predators. He was guarding against the ghosts of Silas Thorne and Jedediah Cole. Their presence in South Pass had been a clear threat. He knew their kind, men who took what they wanted and crushed anyone who stood in their way. He had taken Laura's money for a simple guide job, but he was starting to realize it was something more. He was now tied to her quest, a protector of a secret he didn't even believe in. He looked over at her, a dark shape in the firelight. She was out of her element, unprepared for the harshness of this country. Yet, she was here. There was a stubbornness in her that he recognized, for it was the same quality that kept him going day after day in the face of his own profound loss, a quiet resolve to simply endure. As the last embers of the fire faded to gray, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose beyond his own solitary existence. The land was vast and indifferent, but for the first time in a year, he was not entirely alone in it. The journey had begun. For 2 days, they followed the map into a country that grew wilder and more remote with every mile. The rolling hills gave way to a broken landscape of rocky outcrops and steep-sided canyons. The hidden markings on Laura's map were their only guide. A symbol that looked like a bird's claw led them to a narrow game trail. A series of dots corresponded to a line of ancient, weather-beaten cairns, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding scree. It was a language of the land, one her father had learned to speak, and now she was learning to translate it. Benjamin's initial skepticism slowly began to erode, replaced by a grudging, professional respect. He knew this country, but the path the map laid out was one he would never have found on his own. It was a secret way, a path that followed the logic of water and shadow, rather than the convenience of men. On the 3rd day, they came to a place where the trail seemed to vanish. The map indicated a turn, marked by a drawing of what looked like a man lying on his back, his profile etched against the sky. They spent hours searching the ridge, a jumble of massive sandstone formations, but found nothing that matched the drawing. The sun was hot, the air still. Frustration began to set in. "Maybe this is it," Benjamin said, his voice betraying a hint of his earlier doubt. "Maybe this is where the trail ends." Laura refused to give up. She tethered her horse and began to climb, her hands and worn shoes finding purchase on the rough stone. She remembered her father's letters, filled with detailed observations. He wasn't just a prospector. He was a naturalist. He noticed things others overlooked. She stood on a high ledge, looking at the formations from a new angle. It was no use. They were just rocks, a chaotic jumble of shapes. Dejected, she sat down, pulling the map from her satchel. She studied the drawing again. The sleeping man was there, but next to it, in ink so faded it was nearly invisible even with the lantern trick, was a tiny, intricate drawing of a plant, a species of lichen. She looked around. The rocks were covered in lichen, patches of gray, green, and rust. It was meaningless. But then she remembered a passage from one of his last letters. "There is a species of xanthoria here that is peculiar. It grows only on surfaces that face true north, where the rock holds the morning damp the longest." She stood up, her heart pounding. She wasn't looking for a shape. She was looking for a color. She scanned the rock faces again, ignoring their contours and focusing only on the lichen. On one of the largest formations, a towering block of sandstone, she saw it, a vibrant, almost unnaturally bright orange patch of lichen, growing in a distinct line along a deep fissure, but only on the side that faced north. It was the sleeping man's beard. "Benjamin!" she called out, her voice filled with excitement. "Over here!" He climbed up to join her, and she explained her reasoning. He looked from the map to the rock, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He saw it then, too. The profile was there, but it was subtle, an illusion of light and shadow that was only visible if you knew what to look for. The lichen was the key. "Your father was a clever man," he said, the words a quiet admission of respect. The fissure marked by the lichen was not a dead end. It was a passage, a crack in the rock just wide enough for a person and a horse to pass through in single file. It was a hidden door in the side of the mountain. That evening, as they made camp on the far side of the rock formation, the atmosphere between them had changed. The dynamic of skeptical guide and naive client was gone. They were partners now, joined in a shared purpose. She showed him the secret markings then, holding the map to the campfire, watching his face as the hidden lines emerged in the glow. He stared at the illuminated map, a slow understanding dawning in his eyes. He finally understood the depth of the secret he was helping to protect. He looked at her, the firelight catching the earnest, intelligent light in her eyes. "He left it for you," Benjamin murmured, more to himself than to her. "He knew you'd be the only one who could read it." The path ahead was still unknown, and the threat of thorn and coal still lingered behind them. But for the first time, Laura felt a profound sense of hope. She was not just following a map. She was having a conversation with her father, his wisdom guiding her steps from across the silent divide of death. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of labor and discovery. The land grew steeper, the trail more demanding. They were deep in the foothills now, a place of sharp granite peaks and valleys choked with pine and aspen. Their world shrank to the needs of the moment, finding water, navigating treacherous slopes, caring for the horses. The physical toll was immense. Laura's hands, once stained with ink, were now calloused and scratched. Her muscles ached with a weariness she had never known. Yet, with every hardship, she felt herself growing stronger, shedding the timid schoolteacher she had been and becoming someone new, someone forged by the sun and the stone. She learned to read the clouds, to anticipate the weather's sudden violent shifts. She learned the difference between the tracks of a deer and an elk, the call of a hawk and an eagle. Benjamin was a patient teacher, his instructions spare but precise. He showed her how to tie a diamond hitch to secure the pack mule's load, how to bank a fire to keep coals alive through the night, how to move through the wilderness without leaving a trace. In return, she shared the world of her father's mind. At night, by the fire, she would read passages from his worn copy of Emerson or a volume of poetry she'd brought. His voice, speaking of nature and the soul, filled the vast silence, and Benjamin would listen, his guarded expression softening in the firelight. A quiet, unspoken bond grew between them, woven from shared hardship and mutual respect. The clues on the map continued to guide them. A blaze on an ancient aspen so overgrown with bark it was only a faint scar. A creek that had to be followed upstream against all logic until it led to a hidden waterfall. Each small victory was a confirmation of her father's genius and a testament to their own growing partnership. But as they drew closer to their destination, the signs that they were being followed became more frequent and more unnerving. One morning, Benjamin found a fresh hoof print near their camp, a shod horse, not a wild one. Another day, from a high ridge, he spotted a flicker of movement in the valley behind them, a rider disappearing quickly into a stand of trees. Thorn and Cole were not just following, they were closing the distance. They were better funded, perhaps with fresh horses, and driven by a relentless greed. The threat was no longer a distant memory from a dusty town. It was a living, breathing presence just over the next rise. The knowledge changed the tenor of their journey. The silences became more watchful, the nights more tense. Benjamin's rifle was never far from his hand. He began taking more precautions, choosing campsites that were hidden and easily defended, doubling back on their trail to confuse their pursuers. One afternoon, As they were crossing a wide, shallow river, the pack mule stumbled, its leg wedged between two slick boulders. The animal panicked, threatening to break its leg or drown under the weight of its load. Without a word, Benjamin was in the freezing water, working to calm the animal, his hands feeling for the trap. Laura plunged in after him, her long skirts instantly soaked and heavy, adding her own strength to the effort. Together, bracing against the current, they managed to free the mule and guide it to the far bank. They stood shivering on the shore, soaked to the bone, the supplies saved. In that moment, looking at Benjamin's tired, determined face, Laura realized how much she had come to depend on him, to trust him. He was no longer just a guide. He was her anchor in this wild, beautiful, and dangerous world. Later that evening, as they dried their clothes by a massive fire, he looked at her across the flames. "They won't stop," he said, his voice low and serious. "When we find what your father hid, they'll be there. You need to be ready for that." She met his gaze, her own expression resolute. "I am," she said, and she knew it was true. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective certainty. Whatever her father had died to protect, she would not let men like Thorn desecrate it. She owed him that. She owed it to herself. They found it on the 7th day. The map led them to the mouth of a narrow slot canyon, a dark fissure in a sheer wall of red rock. It looked like a dead end. The air flowing out of it was cool and damp, carrying the scent of moss and wet stone. A shallow creek, no more than a trickle, disappeared into the darkness. Laura consulted the map one last time. There was a final cryptic note written in her father's hand, a quote she recognized from one of his favorite poems, "And you must walk through water to find the wood." This was the place. Benjamin looked at the dark, forbidding entrance, his expression grim. "This is a dangerous path," he warned. "A flash flood in a place like this. We wouldn't stand a chance." But he saw the conviction in her eyes and nodded slowly. "We'll go on foot. Leave the horses here." They tied the animals in a sheltered alcove, and with Benjamin leading the way, stepped into the creek and walked into the canyon. The walls rose hundreds of feet above them, so close in places they could touch both sides at once. The only light was a thin, wavering ribbon of blue sky far overhead. The sound of their splashing footsteps echoed in the immense silence. For nearly an hour they walked, the canyon twisting and turning, until finally the walls began to recede, and a soft, green light appeared ahead. They emerged from the canyon into a place that stole their breath. It was a hidden valley, a perfect bowl of green surrounded on all sides by the towering red cliffs. A lush meadow, fed by the creek, was dotted with wildflowers. And in the center of the meadow, catching the afternoon sun, was a forest unlike any they had ever seen. It was a forest of stone. Hundreds of petrified trees, some standing as tall as their living brethren, others lying in massive broken sections, littered the valley floor. The wood had been replaced by agate, jasper, and quartz, and the sunlight ignited the fossilized logs into a kaleidoscope of color. Deep reds, pearly whites, smoky grays, and brilliant ambers. It was a place of impossible beauty, a geological wonder hidden from the world. "The stone trees," Laura whispered, the old Shoshone woman's words echoing in her mind. They walked among the silent giants, their footsteps muffled by the soft grass. It was a cathedral built by time. Tucked under a wide, protective ledge on the far side of the valley, they found it. Her father's last camp. A rusted fire ring, a few discarded tins, and a small, heavy tin box wedged into a crevice in the rock. Laura's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. She sat on the ground, the journal in her lap, and began to read. Benjamin stood a respectful distance away, his gaze sweeping the valley, a silent guardian. Her father's familiar, neat script filled the pages. He wrote not of gold, but of science and wonder. He was a self-taught geologist and paleontologist, and he had stumbled upon this valley by chance. He knew instantly the significance of his find. It was one of the largest and most perfectly preserved collections of petrified wood in the world. The journal was filled with meticulous drawings, measurements, and scientific observations, but it was the last entry that broke her heart. "Thorn and Cole know I have found something," he wrote. "They think it is a new vein of gold, and their greed is a palpable thing. I have tried to tell them the truth, that the value here is not in what can be mined, but in what can be preserved. They do not understand. They see only tonnage and profit. I fear for this place. I have created a false map to lead them astray, and a true one, a puzzle for my Laura. If you are reading this, my dearest daughter, it is because I have failed to protect it myself. It falls to you now. Do not let them turn this sanctuary into a quarry. This is your inheritance, not of wealth, but of beauty, of wonder. It is a legacy of stone and time." Laura closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. She finally understood. Her father hadn't died chasing riches. He had died protecting a treasure the world didn't even know it had. As if summoned by their discovery, the sky began to darken. The wind picked up, howling through the narrow canyon entrance, and the temperature dropped. A storm, one of Wyoming's sudden violent tempests, was boiling over the cliffs. The first drops of rain, cold and heavy, began to fall. And in that same moment, Benjamin, who had been watching the canyon mouth, stiffened. "They're here," he said, his voice a low growl. Two figures on horseback appeared at the edge of the valley, framed against the dark, roiling clouds. Silas Thorne and Jedediah Cole. They had found the way through. A bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating Thorne's triumphant, greedy smile. He had seen the glistening, gem-like logs. He saw his quarry. "So," he boomed, his voice echoing off the cliffs. The little schoolteacher did have a secret, after all. The rain began to fall in earnest now, a torrential downpour that turned the creek into a muddy, rising torrent. Thorne and Cole spurred their horses forward, but the animals were skittish, unnerved by the storm and the strange, rocky landscape. "There's nowhere to run, Miss Whitcomb," Thorne shouted over the roar of the wind and rain. "Give us the claim papers your father surely left, and we'll let you walk away." Benjamin didn't hesitate. "Get back under the ledge," he yelled to Laura, pushing her toward the shelter of her father's camp. He raised his rifle, the cold metal slick with rain. "This is a private claim," he shouted back, his voice carrying a new authority. "You're trespassing." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A claim? This is a mine, and it's ours." Cole dismounted, pulling a heavy pistol from his belt, his eyes fixed on Benjamin. The storm was a force of nature, but the greed of these men was another kind of storm entirely. Just as Cole raised his pistol, a deafening crack of thunder shook the valley, and a massive bolt of lightning struck the cliff face high above the canyon entrance. The rock shuddered. A shower of pebbles rained down, followed by a low, grinding roar. Benjamin grabbed Laura, pulling her deeper under the overhang as a section of the cliff, loosened by the rain and shattered by the lightning, gave way. A river of rock and mud cascaded down, completely blocking the narrow canyon mouth. They were trapped, all of them. The rock slide had cut off the only exit. Thorn and Cole were stranded on one side of the valley, Laura and Benjamin on the other, with the rising creek and the forest of stone between them. The storm raged, a primal fury unleashed upon the hidden sanctuary. In that moment of chaos, sheltering from the deluge, Benjamin looked at Laura, his face grim but his eyes clear and steady. "Some things are worth holding on to," he said, the words a solemn vow. He was no longer a man for hire. He was a guardian of this place, and of the woman who held its future in her hands. He had made his choice. The storm lasted for hours, a relentless assault of wind and water. The valley floor turned into a shallow lake, the creek overflowing its banks and swirling around the bases of the stone trees. Thorn and Cole were forced to abandon their horses and scramble for higher ground on their side of the valley, huddling under a miserable excuse for a rock outcropping. Laura and Benjamin were safe and dry in the deep recess of her father's camp. They watched the storm, the raw power of it both terrifying and cleansing. The lightning flashes illuminated the petrified forest, making the stone logs gleam like the bones of ancient gods. When the rain finally subsided to a steady drizzle, a deep, profound silence fell over the valley, broken only by the gurgle of receding water. The rock slide at the canyon mouth was a permanent, impassable barrier. There was no way out. Thorn's triumphant greed had turned to trapped desperation. They could see him across the way, a small, pathetic figure, his fine suit soaked and mud-stained. The mountain had humbled him in a way no man ever could. For 3 days, they were prisoners in the valley. Benjamin, using his knowledge of survival, found edible roots and snared a rabbit. He was in his element, while Thorn and Cole, city men out of their depth, were reduced to shouting useless threats that the wind carried away. Their fury slowly gave way to a sullen, defeated silence. On the 4th morning, a new sound echoed in the valley, the distant chip, chip, chip of tools against rock. A rescue party, sent from South Pass City when Thorn and Cole failed to return, was working to clear the slide. When they finally broke through, the sight that greeted them was a strange one. A bedraggled but unbowed rancher and a schoolteacher. And across the valley, 2 mud-caked, miserable men who looked like they had been to war and lost. The story Laura told the sheriff was simple and true. She had come to find her father's legacy. Thorn and Cole had followed, intending to steal it. The mountain, it seemed, had intervened. With no proof of any crime other than trespassing, and with Thorn's reputation in Cheyenne, the sheriff could do little. But their public humiliation was its own form of justice. They rode out of South Pass City the next day, defeated not by law, but by the wilderness they had sought to conquer. Laura and Benjamin traveled to Lander, the territorial capital. In the land surveyor's office, she presented her father's journal. The surveyor, a thoughtful, academic man named Mr. Abernathy, listened to her story with polite skepticism. But as he began to read the journal, his expression changed. He pored over the detailed drawings, the precise measurements, the passionate scientific prose. He examined the small, polished sample of petrified wood she had brought. His skepticism melted away, replaced by a profound and growing excitement. "My dear Miss Whitcomb," he said, his voice filled with awe, "do you have any idea what your father found? It's magnificent. A scientific treasure of incalculable value. News of the stone forest spread through Lander like a prairie fire. The local newspaper ran a story. Geologists from the Territorial University made plans for an expedition. Laura Whitcomb, The quiet schoolteacher who had arrived with nothing was suddenly a local celebrity, the steward of a newly discovered natural wonder. With Mr. Abernathy's help, she filed a claim on the valley. Not a mining claim, but a special petition to the territorial government to have the area protected as a preserve, a natural park for study and for future generations. She used her father's journal as the primary evidence, his own words making the case for him. The townspeople, who might have once dismissed her, now looked at her with a deep and abiding respect. She hadn't found gold, but she had brought them something far more lasting. A piece of the planet's history. A place of pure wonder. Months passed. The autumn sun cast a long, golden light across the foothills of the Wind Rivers. A new, sturdier cabin stood on a rise of land not far from the blocked canyon, a cabin Laura and Benjamin had built together, log by log. The territorial government had approved her petition. The valley was now protected, named the Whitcomb Geological Preserve in her father's honor. From their vantage point, they could see the entrance to the valley, still sealed by the rockslide. A new, safer trail was being planned, one that would allow access for scientists and visitors without disturbing the sanctuary itself. Benjamin had sold his small, lonely ranch and moved his few possessions here. The quiet, wary rancher had found a new purpose. He was the preserve's official warden, its first guardian. He stood beside her now, the comfortable silence between them a testament to all they had shared. His horse, Buck, grazed peacefully nearby. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of pine and curing grass. It was a wind of peace, not of struggle. He looked at her, at the way the setting sun caught the light in her hair. "It's a fine legacy he left you," Benjamin said softly. Laura's gaze was on the hidden valley, a place of profound beauty and deep memory. She thought of her father's journal, of Thorne's empty greed, and of the quiet strength she had found in herself and in the man standing beside her. She reached out and took his hand, her once soft fingers now calloused and strong, fitting perfectly into his. "My father called it a legacy," she replied, her voice clear and steady in the evening air. "But I think it's just a promise. Thank you for staying with us for this story of discovery and perseverance. It's a tale that reminds us that the truest inheritance is not always something you can hold in your hand, but something you choose to protect with your heart." If you found value in Laura's journey, we'd be honored if you'd leave a like and a comment below and subscribe for more stories from the heart of the frontier. We'll see you again soon.